From the land of sky blue waters, Honeycrisp apples, and haunted homes, this is Minnesota Unknown.
Each week we'll take a deep dive into Minnesota's storied past with a special emphasis on the surprising, the unusual, and little-known history hidden in plain sight. My name is Alex Weston.
I'm Hannah Norton.
I'm Josie Bergman.
And we are Minnesota Unknown. If you're listening to this when it came out, it is Halloween. Peak spooky season.
Ooh.
Yeah, we have just wrapped up our St. Paul Legends and Lore walking tour, in which we share a number of ghostly tales as we walk around the Irvin Park neighborhood. And one of the most fascinating stories that we tell there is actually one of the first stories that got me interested in exploring not just the history of St. Paul, but the sort of more informal folklore. Because if you start talking history to anyone in St. Paul and bring up the name Forepaugh, there's two things you'll hear about. One is, it's a very nice restaurant in a historic mansion, but the other is, it's haunted. We'll offer just a little warning here. This topic is going to be talking quite a lot about suicide, as well as infidelity and death and various other things. So if you're sensitive to that, be forewarned. Now, the Forepaugh Mansion, best known today as a restaurant called Forepaugh. It's in a historic 1870 home built by Joseph and Mary Forepaugh, turned into a restaurant in 1976. And it didn't take long until people began experiencing very odd things at this house. People experienced lights turning on and off by themselves, sudden cold spots or sudden hot spots, a chandelier that swings back and forth all on its own, and a few other odd happenings.
Even when we were doing research for our Irving Park tour, we went outside of Forepaugh and we were taking some pictures for the gram. And there was a lady there with her husband. The husband had been a cook there. And she mentioned that she was going upstairs one time in the restaurant and she felt something grab her ankle. So you hear these like little haunting stories,
Yeah.
I feel like.
And I mean, she was convinced that she had had at least one, if not more, deeply paranormal experiences.
We ran into some people while giving our tour, and they started telling us their own stories. It's been written about in nearly every book about ghosts in Minnesota, and we've assembled quite a lot of them. Of course, there's a million websites and things. If you're reading something on ghosts in Minnesota, it's going to have Forepaugh. It's one of the more noted ghost stories. We'll read a couple quotes from that here. This is a man interviewing one of the servers there at the time that this book was written.
So this quote is from the nearly departed Minnesota Ghost Stories and Legends by Michael Norman. But in Tim Olstead, an elementary teacher for the St. Paul school system, inquisitive customers will find someone who willingly shares the ghost stories, even details of his own discourteous tap on the shoulder.
I believe there is something. I think it's an unrested spirit. That's what I believe.
Olmsted says.
People will ask me if I believe in ghosts. No, I don't believe in ghosts, but I believe there are spirits, that there has to be something after this life.
Olmsted was teaching 6th grade in St. Paul and serving at Forepaugh on weekends when he was invited to one of his students' homes for dinner. He gladly accepted. The student's mother asked if it was true that he worked at Forepaugh.
Yes, I do,
replied Olmsted.
Well, do you know the place is haunted?
She asked.
Oh, yes, that's an old story,
Olmsted said casually.
We all know that. We don't call it haunted, though. We say there are unsettled spirits. Well, my grandparents used to live in that house, and crazy things happened when they were there.
She explained that her grandparents had lived there after it had been subdivided into apartments. She told Olmsted that her grandmother was once in the living room reading when the rocking chair she was in levitated and then dropped back to the floor. She was unhurt. On another occasion, the woman's grandfather said a long-dead army buddy showed up at the front door, in full military uniform. But Olmsted does not need to go back that far to recount his own personal knowledge of the place's haunted side. 2 regular customers abandoned their favorite table on the restaurant's 3rd floor after one strange night, he says.
They always sat on the 3rd floor, in the Sibley room. They made jokes about the ghosts and what was going on. One particular night, it got freezing cold at the table they were sitting at. They said it just turned frigid and then went back to a normal temperature. They will not have dinner on the 3rd floor anymore.
The couple described it as a sudden, deep, and numbing cold that lasted only a short time. Then there was the problem of the wax candles. At one time, Forepaugh used old-fashioned wax candles in the dining rooms and as part of each table's centerpiece. At the end of each evening shift, waitstaff would extinguish the candles. The Major D made his own rounds to confirm the candles were out. Olmsted says that on at least one occasion when all the staff had left and the maitre d' was getting in his own car and leaving, he noticed a candle left alight in the third-floor window. He unlocked the building, went back upstairs, and blew it out. But when he got back into his car a few minutes later, the candle was again relit. Olmsted said weird teasing wasn't unusual.
There have been times when glasses have shattered, or the staff comes in the next day and finds the chairs are tipped upside down, all the tables, silver, china, everything's all strewn about.
One of the more well-known stories of Forepaugh's involves a nearly 20-year-old photograph nicknamed the Ghost Bride, though the ghost and the bride are two separate entities. In the photograph, a smiling bride and groom, Michelle and Robert, pose for a wedding day picture on the second-floor hallway. They are standing in front of a lace-curtained window near a short flight of steps leading to a separate dining room. But what startles those who see the picture is that behind the bride and to her left is an extended disembodied arm clad in a tight white sleeve that seems to be reaching out to her from the staircase. Only the arm from the elbow down to the wrist is visible. Whether the arm belongs to a man or to a woman, ghost or guest, is open to conjecture. Michelle, the bride in the photograph, says no one was standing next to her. Indeed, part of the arm does seem transparent.
And we have a different account here from Haunted St. Paul by Chad Lewis.
It is while dining that both staff and guests have reported seeing the ghostly image of a man leisurely walking through the restaurant. Witnesses told me that this arrogant-looking man seems to act as if he owns the place. While working throughout the restaurant, the staff would catch the glimpse of a woman walking by, yet, when they turned to get a better look, the woman had somehow vanished into thin air. For years, these sightings persisted, and no one spoke of his or her individual sightings for fear of what coworkers might think. It wasn't until customers began to report seeing the vanishing woman that the staff members finally felt comfortable enough to share their own encounters. What is unusual about the sightings are the similarities that exist among the many various reports. Most people report that the phantom woman looks as though she comes from an earlier time period. The woman is seen dressed in a Victorian outfit as though she lived during the late 1800s or early 1900s. The other detail that sticks out in the mind of witnesses is the near transparency of the woman.
But of course, as weird as these happenings are, something deep inside human nature isn't satisfied with just a spooky story. We want to know about the real human history behind that. And so a popular legend has attached itself to this location. The ghosts that are being seen or that are turning lights on and off or putting candles on and out or grabbing people or tapping them on the shoulders are said to be those of Joseph Forepaugh himself and an ill-fated maid named Molly. As the story goes, Molly was employed by Joseph, and the two of them had an affair. In some versions, Mary, Joseph's wife, found out and fired Molly, and distraught, Molly hung herself from a rope from the chandelier in the third floor in most stories. In other versions, she became pregnant, and when Joseph refused to acknowledge his paternity, Molly hung herself. In all versions, Molly ends up haunting the house to this day along with Joseph, who himself also died by suicide, shooting himself in the head shortly afterwards. Now, we are not paranormal investigators.
Yet.
We are not here to dispute anyone's firsthand experience. We are historians. And so we're not going to weigh in one way or the other on whether we think this home is actually haunted or not. That's not our area of expertise. But the story about Molly and Joseph, that's the kind of thing that tends to leave traces in the historical record. So we are going to look into this and see what the truth behind the history of the Forepaugh mansion was.
We can only look at the records and the facts that are there. We cannot speak to whether there are ghosts or not. We can only say this is what exists in the records that we have.
Indeed. Now, I'm going to first start with a few facts that are not disputed by anyone. A couple things from that legend that can be confirmed. There was a Joseph Forepaugh. Joseph Lindbrandt Forepaugh was born in 1837 in Philadelphia. He arrived in St. Paul in 1858, fresh from an apprenticeship at a wholesale imported dry goods firm in Philadelphia. And with the help of some partners, he founded his own dry goods firm, which soon became one of the largest in the upper Midwest. He also, early on, got a contract to supply shoes to a major portion of the United States Army, which, when he got that contract in 1860, was not a big deal because the army was not that big. It was about to get a whole lot bigger, and thanks in part to the U.S. Civil War and all the boots on the ground, he was doing incredible business. By 1864, the business was generating sales of $500,000 a year, and in 1865, it was renamed the J.L. Forepaugh and Company. So he's riding high, and at the age of 36, he spends $10,000, that's in 1870s dollars, to build the first stage of this mansion. He would later add on to the house a few years later. So that part of the legend is true.
Okay, so he takes his money, he builds a big house. Describe that house to me, won't you? Style, fixins.
It's in a style that was very popular right around 1870 and was inspired by French architecture of the time. And so architecture nerds call this the Second Empire, referring to the Second French Empire, the first being the one under Napoleon. Now Napoleon III is on the throne. It's what you think of most likely when you think of a haunted house. Like, think of the house from Psycho. That is a French Empire house. It's got a mansard roof, which is like a kind of sloping in. It's got decorative little gingerbread brackets over the windows and things. It's just one of those houses that, thanks to Hollywood, is deeply associated with hauntings.
And right in the back, it has a giant window framing a chandelier that Molly, the maid, hung herself from on the third floor, right?
That's the story. Now, the thing is, that part of the third floor actually wasn't added until 1978. So, one little detail we can debunk, which doesn't necessarily negate the entire story, but if Molly did hang herself somewhere in the house, it wasn't from that chandelier, because that chandelier and indeed that whole part of the house did not exist yet in Molly's time. The next detail that does line up with the story, almost, is that Joseph Forepaugh himself did indeed die by suicide. However, it was many years later, and he was no longer living in this house. They actually only lived in that house during the 1870s and early 1880s, and then spent much of the 1880s living in Europe, touring different spa towns at the advice of their doctor, basically for mental health reasons. The way they described it at the time, Joseph suffered from a deep melancholy. He was described as a melancholic. He was described as having a nervous disorder. It's hard to know exactly how that might strike a modern psychologist, but I think it's fair to say something like clinical depression or something in that neighborhood. He was troubled, and he was quite rich. He was retired. He was able to spend a lot of time in Europe, but they did eventually move back to St. Paul, building a house at 302 Summit Avenue in 1889. But in 1892, Joseph took his own life. This is from his obituary published in the St. Paul Globe, July 10th, 1892.
The dead body of Joseph L. Forepaugh, a wealthy and respected citizen of St. Paul, was found at 11:15 yesterday morning, lying beside a pond in the vicinity of the Selby Avenue Bridge over the Milwaukee Railroad tracks. A bullet wound in the head and the revolver still clasped in the dead man's hand clearly indicated suicide.
So that is the very tragic end of Joseph. Speculation about what drove him to this is fairly absent from the contemporary news coverage. There's various obituaries and things, but most of the people who knew him noted that he'd been a melancholic.
Showing signs of what we would consider now to be depression.
Yeah, exactly. Though, there was speculation about his finances. Now, one of the things a lot of the ghost books today insist is that he was doing fine with money. And so rumors about Molly the maid started to come out because people wanted to know why he had done this. And it clearly couldn't have been money. If you actually go back into the newspapers and just search Joseph Forepaugh, a lot of the things that come up is he had a lot of lawsuits against different interests of his. Now, they weren't against him directly, but he was well invested in real estate, and there was just a lot of legal trouble going on. He also had quite a lot of debt, and he was well invested in a lot of companies that had just been hit hard by what would be the first ripplings of what would grow into a full-blown panic in 1893. So he had actually lost a lot of money, and there's reason to think that could have been part of what was on his mind or part of what drove him, if we were to speculate. But really, it's probably not too fruitful to speculate about these sorts of things anyway. He had admitted at different times in his life that he'd had suicidal ideation, so this was, a recurring pattern. It's why he'd spent several years in Europe. What's not mentioned in any of the papers, though, is any affair, anyone named Molly, any sign that Mary is anything other than a grieving widow. And it's the kind of thing they absolutely would have mentioned. You might think, okay, they're being nice. They're not trying to drag up all this dirt. The newspapers of that time loved to dig up dirt.
They were not nice, and they would find dirt that didn't exist and just say things.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of the newspapers basically dragged him through the mud for killing himself. Suicide was highly stigmatized, as was any sort of mental health issue. And the initial reportings on his suicide were basically like, what a horrible thing this guy has done. What a loser. What, I'm paraphrasing, but.
Or in some of the obituaries, even the positive ones, it's like, well, he did do this horrible thing of taking his life, but he was a good guy. So it's kind of harping on him.
Yeah. And in fact, the reason we know he had suicidal ideation and that he was melancholic is some of his friends write letters to the editor after these things, basically trying to rebut, saying like, we shouldn't be too hard on him. He was clearly struggling with inner demons his whole life, or at least trying to say we shouldn't be too hard on our friend Joseph. Leave him alone. But the point is, the initial newspaper reporting was not at all kind. And if there was something juicy like an extramarital affair and a maid's suicide
or
behind this,
a body found in a wealthy
neighborhood park, they would have been all over that. Now, I'll have to say this several times during the podcast. It's hard to prove a negative. So an absence of proof does not mean the thing didn't happen. But as historians, we're just looking for anything that might confirm the basic details of this story. And so far, we've not found them.
But we weren't able to even find evidence that really anyone named Molly ever worked at the Forepaugh home. I mean, looking at census records, there's nothing. And had he had an affair with a maid resulting in a pregnancy, that would have been reported in the papers, most likely. That's not easy to hide. There were other staff in the home. There were other family. There were neighbors. Like, this wouldn't have been kept quiet.
Especially in connection with his tragic end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If there was something like that, that's when it would have come out.
But you're right that there should be a paper trail. Now, that being said, the historic record is only fragmentary. We don't have what we don't have. We don't know what we don't know. Case in point, did a maid named Molly, and she's never given a last name, but did anyone named Molly ever work for the Forepaughs? They were very wealthy, so they had a number of live-in domestic servants, as most wealthy Victorians did. And we can look to the censuses, and they will list people who are living there in the house at the time the census taker was there. But census is only every 10 years. There's then a state census every 5 years. So you're just getting a little snapshot. If Molly worked there any other time than when the census was there, she wouldn't necessarily appear in the censuses. But, if we did find a Molly there, that would have been really encouraging to verifying the story. We didn't.
Sorry. And you looked under different variations of Molly. So Molly can be a nickname for Mary. It can be a nickname for Margaret.
Exactly.
So you looked pretty thoroughly and
couldn't find anything there. The next place is the city directories. Not always, but sometimes domestic servants would actually get their name listed in the city directory, which is kind of the precursor to the phone book. I know you Gen Z kids will have to look up what a phone book is, but it was a thing. The city directory, a lot of these, including the ones from St. Paul during the 1870s, 80s, they're digitized now, which is great because that means they're searchable. So I can search for the address of Forepaugh's mansion, and anyone who listed that as their address, I'll be able to find it. There were a couple servants listed on different times that were living there, listed that as their address. None of them are named Molly. Again, that does not mean that there never was a Molly there. It just means we haven't found a smoking gun, so to speak. The one that does, I think, give me the most reason to doubt the story of Molly is the Ramsey County Medical Examiners, formerly the Ramsey County Coroner's Office, keeps really good records of deaths in Ramsey County going back to the 19th century, and they're listed by address. And so we can see who died at any given house, and there is no listing of anyone dying by suicide or any other sort of unusual means, or anyone dying really during the period that the Forepaughs were living there. So again, maybe they covered it up. This was a wealthy family. It's the kind of thing you don't want getting out there. But if a suicide did happen in that house, it would most likely show up in those coroner's records and you'd want to find it. We didn't find it. And again, I also just searched the newspapers, which the St. Paul papers of that time are also digitized and searchable. So you search maid, Molly, hanging, suicide, killed herself. Yeah, I searched, various related terms and of course had to scour through all sorts of things that are completely unrelated, but I couldn't find anything any article about a domestic servant hanging herself. Again, this doesn't prove it never happened, but it is a long way from being able to prove that it did. So I have my doubts. Now, the next sort of thing in this story is, as I already mentioned, they were not living there. And a lot of the tellings of the stories have these two deaths happening in close succession. So usually Molly hangs herself first, and then Joseph shoots himself. I've heard a couple versions where Joseph shoots himself and then Molly hangs herself, but it's always in quick succession. Since we know that Joseph actually did die in 1892, it's just very weird to wonder, why did he return to his previous house, and why did Molly also? Especially Molly. Like, what attachment would she have to that house?
And by return, you mean why did her spirit return?
Why did her
spirits return?
So there's questions. Now, all of that is to say, that's about as far as we can go with looking into the history. But the last place was, I just tried to search everything possible to find any variations of the story. I wanted to know how long this story has been floating around St. Paul. And I couldn't find any tellings of it in newspapers or anything else that's been printed, at least, from before the early 1980s. In other words, these stories seem to have been spreading after the restaurant opened. And some of that tracks with the fact that we began experiencing paranormal strange things at the restaurant. But I can't find any references to Molly or this tragic affair in any earlier things. And again, that's the kind of juicy story that, even apart from ghosts, might have left a trace somewhere. Now, I've heard this story personally from dozens and dozens of people, and that's partly because I used to work for many years as a guide and eventually as a researcher and programmer at the Alexander Ramsey House, which is directly across the street from Forepaugh's. So we would get guests all the time that would ask us about the stories they'd heard and then repeat the story. And my favorite variation is that Molly not only hanged herself from the chandelier on the third floor, but it was actually during a birthday party for Mary that was happening on the lawn outside, and that she placed the noose around her neck, called out to Joseph, who was out on the lawn with Mary, and said, "I've done this all for you," and then jumped out through the plate glass window, hanging until dead. And the reason that's my favorite variation is I'm a horror movie fan, and I recognize that as directly a scene from the 1976 film The Omen, in which a little child who's actually the spawn of Satan inspires one of his servants to hang herself in an identical manner with a birthday party happening on the lawn, jumping out the window, all of that. So I think somewhere along the way, someone juiced up this story a little bit with this scene from The Omen. That's an unusual variant, but a striking one, because we can see exactly where that story came from.
For me, that's really like the clincher at the end of this. To me, that's where it kind of becomes a closed case, because that's a very obvious parallel.
Yeah.
And at a similar time.
Yep.
Well, there's so many stories of like maid hangs self and haunts home. Like, this is a very classic tale that people like to tell.
And not completely fabricated either. I mean, there were a lot of power dynamic relationships happening in these homes at those times.
You did hear from previous bartenders at Forepaugh's that they made up and told that story.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So I did, in a Facebook post about this a couple years ago, in one of the many Facebook groups I'm in about Old St. Paul, someone had posted about the ghost, and someone in the comments said, "I was working at Forepaugh's in the 70s. We made that story up." I reached out to this person through private messages, and they did request that they not be named, but they did tell me that they worked there and that they had made this story up, though they did also swear they'd experienced weird things. So he said, "We made up the thing about Molly, but it is haunted." So this was just a random person on the internet, so take it for what it's worth. But it does ring plausible to me that the story of the ghost of Molly and Joseph really does start with staff at Forepaugh's. Now, he said he made it up, but I have reason to think that they didn't make it up whole cloth. Because as I was searching through this, I looked at online forums, old websites, thank you Wayback Machine, old issues of Fate magazine, a locally published magazine where people would write in with their own paranormal experiences, looking for as many different versions of this story as I could find. And I actually found a version of it that predates the opening of Forepaugh's, the restaurant, but is connected to an entirely different house. This was about the Chauncey Griggs mansion, which is on 476 Summit. And if you Google that, just like Forepaugh's, what you'll find is a lot of claims that this is the most haunted house in Minnesota. So, did this story, and in this case, it's that the owner of the house, sometimes identified as Chauncey Griggs, sometimes anonymous because it's a house where various people lived over the years. But this is another giant Gilded Age mansion up on Summit Avenue in St. Paul's Mansion District. And the story there goes that a maid named Molly, or in some versions named Mary, had an affair with the male owner of the house. The affair was discovered, or there was a pregnancy that wasn't acknowledged, or it ended badly, however, and the maid took her own life, hanging herself by a chandelier on the 4th floor. In this one.
So a big difference.
A big difference because remember, Molly hung herself from the 3rd floor.
So it's a very, very different scenario.
Very different.
Four is one more than 3.
It is.
You would think 4 paws, 4th floor.
No. Pause that line of thought.
But I found a reference from 1966 to this exact story, and this was in Fate magazine, which was a magazine dedicated to the sort of supernatural and paranormal, and they had a regular column where readers would write in with their own paranormal experiences.
Oh boy.
So that's the earliest reference I can find to it. So I have a theory that this story started associated with a completely different Gilded Age mansion in St. Paul, and later sort of migrated to Forepaugh.
Right, because Forepaugh opened after that would have been published.
Yeah. Forepaugh opened in 1976. And in this sense, it's almost like a classic sort of urban legend that gets local details applied. So one of the things that people who've studied urban legends will see is when these stories are told and believed, so, there was a guy with a hook for a hand, and this actually happened outside my house. Like, there's always local details. Oh, this actually happened to a cousin of mine. It happened in this exact place. And it turns out that exact same story is happening in different places all around the country. Maybe the maid hanging herself is sort of that kind of urban legend where it's just a generic sort of plot line to explain any ghost. So here's what may have happened. Forepaugh opens as a restaurant. Staff and customers alike start experiencing strange things, but we need a story behind that. It's not enough to just say something spooky's going on here. We want a human, tragic backstory to our ghosts. And this story was already kind of floating around St. Paul, attached to a different place. Maybe someone had heard it. Maybe someone misremembered it. And it just at some point gets repeated and then forever is associated with Forepaugh. So next I started looking into the history of the Griggs Mansion, doing all of the same sorts of deep research that I did on the Forepaugh Mansion, because maybe something like this did actually happen. Maybe we just had the mansion wrong. And that cliffhanger is where we will end this episode. But fear not, dear listeners, we will be back with part 2 next week. As we were just discussing at the end there, our research into the legend of Molly and the haunting of Forepaugh led us to discover evidence that this very same story had been circulating long before Forepaugh's restaurant opened, but taking place in an entirely different St. Paul home, the Chauncey Griggs Mansion at 476 Summit Avenue. Alongside Forepaugh, the Griggs Mansion is often claimed to be the most haunted home in Minnesota. In this case, the spirits of the ill-fated maid and her employer are not alone. According to some accounts, as many as 13 different ghosts or entities are said to haunt the Griggs Mansion. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will share those stories and do a similar investigation into the actual history of the mansion and try to see if the legends hold up. Be sure to subscribe and follow in the podcast app of your choice so that you don't miss it. You can find detailed show notes for this and all episodes at minnesotaunknown.com/podcast. We'll post a link there to each episode, along with features such as accompanying images, links to more info, and a list of our sources cited. If you have questions, comments, corrections, complaints, or compliments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at info@minnesotaunknown.com. We'd truly love to hear from you. We also give history walking tours in and around the Twin Cities. To learn about our current and upcoming tours, head to minnesotaunknown.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Just look for Minnesota Unknown. Minnesota Unknown is produced, hosted, written, and researched by Hannah Norton, Josie Bergman, and myself, Alex Weston. This episode was edited by me. Our theme song is by Union Shakedown. This episode is copyright 2025 by Minnesota Unknown, LLC. All rights reserved.